So you wrote this book, Discipline Without Damage, How to Get Your Kids to Behave Without Messing Them Up. So it begs the question, like, let's actually like go slightly dark first. Like, what are the ways that parenting has messed kids up? And I'm very hesitant to ask this because I hate like the pressure that we have on parents as far as like, I remember thinking like, in the first 3 years is so important, your kid's development. I'm like, oh my God, I messed up my kids forever, right? Is it really those first 3 years where we're like shaping every bit of neuron that they have? Or like, what are the things that are damaging that we do want to avoid and try to move away from? Or maybe that our parents did even.
Yeah. Well, let's land first off on a couple of very hopeful pieces.
Oh, good.
Number one is that neuroplasticity, or the brain's
Yes.
ability to change based on external influence, is alive and well across the lifespan. And while it is true that it's easier to get in and make those changes in the early years, kind of 0 to 8-ish, we know for the first roughly 25 to 30 years, the brain is in full on maturation mode and doesn't fully mature until somewhere around the age of 30. So
Oh,
you've
wow.
got some time, just take a big old deep breath. And the second positive is that when we look at a lot of the literature where they, really get into the nitty gritty of coding relational exchanges between parents and their children, the bottom line is that even in the best relationships that are playing out exactly in the manner that nature intended, those parents are only on it about 30% of the time. And the rest of the
What?
absolutely, it's a
Hold on. 30% of the time. That's amazing. 30% of the time, dear listener. Did you hear that? Wait, just repeat that whole thing again, because that's amazing.
So the idea is that babies, infants, toddlers, preschoolers, children, and also spouses, FYI, put out bids for connection.
Hmm.
And when a parent responds to the child's bid, that's like a closed circle of interaction. So we've completed the loop. There was a bid and there was a response. In the best parent-child relationship, the bid response dance is completed only about 30% of the time. Now, here's the trick.
Wow.
The rest of the time, you're either falling out of connection or finding your way back into connection. The damage, if you will, occurs when you're out of connection and there's no move being made towards reparation. So we're not
Hmm.
finding ourselves moving back into connection, which segues quite nicely into your question, which really was about what is it that we do that kind of messes our kids up? Like, how do we damage them? And the motivation behind writing that book is that family after family after family after family over my 20-year career has come into the clinic seeking support, typically around their children's challenging behaviors. And what I have noticed is it's actually the forms of discipline that parents are coached to use by the dominant pop culture on child raising that, in fact, end up damaging the child and escalating those challenging behaviors. And
Hmm.
the reason for that is most of those approaches to discipline involve some form of relational disconnect, either
Mhm.
physical and or emotional. So if you think about a timeout, there's a physical disconnect and a relational disconnect. If you think about even things like reward systems, or if you don't do this, then I'm going to do this, or if you act that way again, you lose ABC XYZ. And so there's a threat embedded in those, which is a form of relational disconnect. And so the more we throw relational disconnect at our children, the more they are going to actually have to increase their loudness in terms of behaviors of one form or another, because relationship is as essential to their well-being, their healthy development, as air. Without
Yeah.
it, the human baby will literally die. So that's,
Yeah, yeah. And there was that study of like an orphanage in somewhere where after a war where a bunch of babies were put and they were not given that holding, and they were given food, they were given all the different things, but they weren't given the connection and they died.
en masse.
That's amazing. So there's so much you said there, Vanessa, that I love so much, that is so interesting. And then it really kind of brings me back to like, well, the things maybe that were damaging, right? Like when we think of things that are damaging, we know that things like corporal punishment, spanking, hitting children is really damaging for them. And it makes a lot of sense because when their whole, developmental modus operandi is connection, right? Because that's how human beings survive in the world, is connection. And that's how they learn in the world, is connection. And when that connection to this like loving attachment figure is really broken in such an intense way, and you're hurt by that figure, then that can, and then there's no kind of repair made, because the parents think like, I have to do this, I'm scaffolded by this history in this system, and this is what people tell me I should do. Maybe not with the spanking or the timeouts or whatever, right? Like the softer version of that in the future. Then they feel like the child is in the wrong and I am doing this thing to correct the behavior. And so there is no like kind of reconnection afterwards, but it really just kind of creates this separation. And so then the child's doing more for attention and connection afterwards. That's what you're saying?
Yeah, so they have to escalate in one way, shape, or form. And because behavior is the primary mode of communication for the growing child, usually the escalation involves some version of amping up these challenging behaviors. It can also involve, so that would be a child who's acting out, but it can also involve a child who begins to act in. So children who become full of self-loathing, children who believe that they're not worthy of love, they're not worthy of affection, they're not worthy of even just being here on this earth, which then, goes underground and can emerge as anxiety, depression, self-harm, suicidality, those kinds of things. And so we really want to look at what nature intended for children and base our parenting decisions on contemporary science around child development, not on how our parents did it with us.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay. So I want to go there. I want to go to what should we base it on? But I just want to underscore this because sometimes the listeners like, yes, sometimes you may be listening to this because you had a partner say, honey, listen to this. You got to hear what Dr. Vanessa and Hunter are saying about this. Like, so the things that are damaging, some of the things that are damaging, just to kind of like, if we were going to do a bulleted list, like definitely like the spanking, any kind of corporal punishments, the research shows that's hugely damaging. What else? If we're just going to kind of say like, we really need to understand that these things are not going to create better behaved kids. They're actually going to damage your relationship. What are they?
So timeouts, removal of privileges, use of reward systems, and the use of contrived consequences.
So, okay. Yeah. Great.
So really anything where, if you want to like boil it down to one thing, which would envelop all of the corporal punishment stuff and all of the stuff that I've just listed off, that one thing that unites all of those forms of discipline is that there's some kind of threat embedded in them. So when we use threat, I'm going to take this away, this will happen to you if you don't do this for me, whatever it is. When there's some kind of threat involved, then you can bet that that's damaging the relationship. And the child will have to then switch over into survival mode. And if you thought it was hard to raise a child before, you just wait till you've got a kid in survival mode. It's going to be a rough ride.
Yeah. Yeah. Like if they're in fight, flight, or freeze, but I just want to name right here, like, threat is like, that's like my like go-to, right? You know what I mean? It's not my preferred go-to, but it's my habit of what I was conditioned to do from my parents and my culture is that's the thing. Those are the thoughts that come up in my mind, especially when I'm feeling stuck in my worst moments with my kids. It's like, And I even say it now sometimes, like, I want to threaten you right now. But
Yeah.
it's so embedded in our culture. Like, I just want
Oh,
to name that right here because the listener might think, oh my God, I'm a terrible person. I'm threatening.
right.
I'm those are the thoughts that are coming to my mind too. So I just wanted, it's
Yeah.
very, very normal and common. It's so, so common.
And I think important, thank you for naming it out loud. It's so important that we land on that for parents, because we will parent as we were parented, full stop. It doesn't matter if you have 13 years of post-secondary education and you think you're going to have this parenting thing in the bag, and then your babies are born and they make you crazy at times. And your go-to default programming is going to be what was embedded in your psyche, if you will, when you were a young child. And by virtue of the fact of where we are in our history, almost 100% of your listeners were raised by parents who would have used some kind of what I'll call behaviorist approach to
Yeah.
parenting, which would have involved that sort of threat control thing, not because they were bad parents. That's because that was what was available to them. And actually, if we were going to deep dive into sort of historical context and the proximity to World War and all of those kinds of things, that form of parenting in that day and age, not that it was great for kids, but it made a lot of sense. The challenge is, fast forward to present day, we know better. And as Maya Angelou says, we must then do better, right? And we understand that this is not what our children need. And so it's upon us to do two things. One is we've got to grow ourselves. Like, we've got to figure out, okay, I got a program that's underneath the surface here. How do I know that? Because when I'm triggered, the first thought that takes over my brain in a black, cloudy storm is, I want to threaten you, right? And we all have that. I have
Yeah.
that as well. And I'm a child psychologist who wrote that book, right? And so we all have that as default programming. It's upon us to understand that and figure out how we can bring some light into that history and heal it, so that in the growing of ourselves, we can show up in a different way for the growing up of our children. And that's when we, I don't know, change the world.
Catch new episodes of the Mindful Mama podcast and other free resources, including the Mindful Mom Guide at mindfulmamamentor.com. You can listen to every back catalog episode, including interviews with Dr. Dan Siegel, Ianla Van Zant, Sharon Salzberg, and get meditations, join our private Facebook group, and more. Go to mindfulmamamentor.com now. I'll see you there.